that up till now, a lot of Russian logistic support, equipment, machinery, and men could be in Russian occupied Ukraine, but be out of range of the Ukrainian weapons. As of today, as of Storm Shadow being in the hands of the Ukrainians, there isn't one corner of Russian occupied Ukraine where the Ukrainians can't strike the Russian forces.
It's not just about starting an offensive, it is about sustaining it, because when it comes, it'll be burning through munitions as well as personnel pretty quickly at an alarming rate.
Yes, and I think that's a really good point, John, because there is a view that despite the fact Volodymyr Zelensky said his objective is to clear every Russian out of occupied Ukrainian territory, most Western analysts think that taking back Crimea would be incredibly difficult to do, certainly not this year. And on the Donbass, even if he was able to get the Donbass back, he'd be inheriting an insurgency of biblical proportions, which would be really difficult to manage. So, more pragmatically, most of the West think this is more about securing the land bridge between the Donbass and Crimea, and then potentially being in a better solution to have a start negotiations of some form, and that's a completely different topic altogether.
Give us your take, Sean, if you would, on the importance of the longer range missiles, which Britain is, and others, of course, but Britain is sending to Ukraine. How should they be used?
Well, the simplest answer, I think, is that up till now, a lot of Russian logistic support, equipment, machinery, and men could be in Russian occupied Ukraine, but be out of range of the Ukrainian weapons. As of today, as of Storm Shadow being in the hands of the Ukrainians, there isn't one corner of Russian occupied Ukraine where the Ukrainians can't strike the Russian forces. Not one corner.
Mm.
And that creates a really interesting conundrum for the Russians, who are used to piling up big stockpiles of weapons and stuff like that. It doesn't give them safety. If you go back 6 months to 9 months, the Russians knew that the Ukrainians had 20-kilometre artillery, so it moved its logistics 21 kilometres behind the front line. Then the Americans were able to give HIMARS, which went out to 50 miles. They had to move their logistics even further back. Now that we're talking about 300 kilometres, there isn't anywhere safe. So it does create a real conundrum for Russia. So that's why it's really, really important to have this sort of capability in Ukrainian hands.
All right. Now, last question briefly. As a former Air Force commander, this concept of air superiority, Vladimir Zelensky was talking about it again today. What is air superiority and who has it?
Well, what it is stopping your enemy bombing your troops from the air. One of the things that Western forces have prided themselves in is that you're incredibly vulnerable if an air force, your enemy air force, can attack you on the ground. So stopping them coming over your troops, establishing air supremacy over over the battlefield is vital. Then you can drop weapons on the enemy. Unfortunately, Volodymyr Zelensky doesn't have a very modern air force. His air force is made up of Russian jets, which are of a lower standard than the Russians have and significantly fewer. They've been pretty smart with the use of air defense missiles and stuff like that. But Volodymyr Zelensky is really determined to get modern fighter aircraft, and he's pushing that button, banging that drum again today. The challenge is you can't just provide them with jets. If I lined up F-16s and gave them to Zelensky, he wouldn't be able to use them. His pilots wouldn't be able to operate them. They wouldn't be able to fly them. It's not like give him a gun or give him a tank. There are months, potentially years worth of training involved. And that's why Rishi Sunak announced that pilot training would start in the UK at a flying school this summer for Ukrainian pilots, so that when the West is able to give jets, then at least the long pole in the tent, the difficult piece of this, training their pilots, will already have commenced.
What about the wait, assuming we are waiting and it hasn't somehow started, for Ukraine's big counter-offensive? From the available information, Sean, because you'll be looking at information and data, I'm sure, the entire time, how do you assess Ukraine's readiness for what's to come?
Well, part of the challenge here is you're talking about a David and Goliath competition, aren't you? When is David going to have a go at taking on Goliath and pushing them back? That is not an easy challenge. Now, part of that has been about holding the Russian offensive earlier on this year, and Ukraine, apart from Bakhmut, seems to have held out pretty well. And even in Bakhmut, there's been slow grinding progress from the Russians. But actually, what's been happening is just gradually getting all of the military equipment that the West has offered. The NATO Secretary General announced the other day that 98% of that had been promised is now available. The main battle tanks are available. The long range artillery is available. Now the Storm Shadow is available.
Yeah.
So part of this, I think, is just and let's be clear as well, John. I think one of the things that the West is, particularly the media, we're expecting this big fanfare, and suddenly the starting gun goes off and off they go. The phase one of this offensive almost certainly will be a shaping operation. It will be hitting Russian logistics in their rear area. It'll be taking out oil supplies. It'll be taking out rail yards. And we've been seeing some of that over the last few weeks.
Yes.
In a way, I think we've seen the opening overtures of the offensive already started.
And I guess a certain amount of dummies and feints to try to draw the Russians into the wrong place at the wrong time.
Yeah, I mean, deception is all part of modern warfare, and I think I'd be quite surprised if the offensive started whilst Volodymyr Zelensky is on the road. He's doing a sort of whistle-top tour at the moment of Germany, France, Italy, and the UK earlier on today with Rishi Sunak over at Chequers. And all of that seems to be, there's a couple of, well, there's several agendas flowing out from there, one of which I think it triggers those leaders to offer a little bit more. Rishi Sunak's offered hundreds of air defense missiles and some armed drones. Germany and France have both offered more things. But I think there was a couple of real subliminal points there, one of which was if Zelensky could have wound the clock back a year and known what the West would have provided, if we could have unlocked this a year ago rather than doing really crawl, walk, run, would that have affected the outcome of the war? And what he doesn't want to do is look back in 6 months' time and think we've still been pretty cautious about handing over equipment when we have no reason to be. So